Donald Trump resorted to more diplomacy via his social media site. He posted, "Israel, do not drop those bombs. If you do, it is a major violation. Bring your pilots home now." 30 minutes later, he posted this, quote, "Israel is not going to attack Iran. All planes will turn around and head home," while doing a friendly plane wave to Iran, whatever a plane wave is. Trump also lashed out, rhetorically, should we say, from the South Lawn. Little warning for those of you with kiddos at home. His comments are profanity-laced.
We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
We can stop here for a sec to reflect on that and on where we are. It's difficult to imagine any previous president talking like that publicly with so much on the line and with so many different sides watching every word and every bit of body language from the American political policymakers. Matters of war and peace, the lives of human beings in at least 3 countries on the line. But this is Donald Trump, who at every step of the way prioritizes optics and his own gut reactions over deliberate policy agendas. Donald Trump, who, according to some pretty comprehensive reporting since the strike in the New York Times, was so impressed by the success of the Israeli operation that he wanted in on the action. So now Trump is claiming that American and Israeli airstrikes have completely destroyed Iran's nuclear facilities. He used the word obliterated Saturday night. And then this morning, he lashed out at the media again when pressed about reports that Iran's nuclear program was indeed damaged, but not destroyed. Here's what we know right now. This is breaking just now in the New York Times, citing officials familiar with the findings. The New York Times is reporting this, quote, "A preliminary classified U.S. report says the American bombing of Iran's nuclear sites sealed off the entrances to 2 of the facilities, but did not collapse their underground buildings. The early findings conclude that the strikes over the weekend set back Iran's nuclear program by only a few months." Donald Trump injecting spin and chaos into what is already a volatile situation in the Middle East is where we start again today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube is at the Pentagon for us again. Also joining us is New York Times diplomatic correspondent Michael Crowley, and former State Department spokesman Ned Price is here as well. Courtney, take us through what you're reporting at this hour.
Well, we're all still watching to see what happens with the ceasefire. At this point, I just spoke with a couple of officials here. There's no indication that there's been any further back and forth between Israel or Iran. And critically, we still have no confirmed reports of any additional attacks or attempts against any bases housing Americans in the Middle East. This is just about 24 hours after we saw Iran fire off a number of missiles, more than a dozen missiles, towards Al Udeid, the air base that houses Americans in Qatar, and fortunately they were either shot down or impacted without doing any real damage or causing any casualties. So that's the latest from the Pentagon. We're all also watching this news out of the New York Times about this early intelligence assessment. I think the big question right now is whether, it's very obvious that this was a successful strike in that they hit the targets. The military, there's no question that they hit the targets that they were going after. But the big question is, did it actually set the program back? And that is what we're still trying to get an assessment on. This fabulous reporting out of the New York Times, Nicole.
So this reporting, Michael Crowley, I'm going to ask you to speak to this. I want to read the bylines on the story. It's Julian Barnes, who covers Intel, Helene Cooper, who is Courtney's colleague, covers the Pentagon, Eric Schmidt, who also covers the Pentagon, Ronan Bergman, who I think is still based in Israel, Maggie Haberman, and Jonathan Swan, who cover the White House. A 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 byline story that says this. A preliminary classified U.S. report says the American bombing of Iran's nuclear sites sealed off the entrances to 2 of the facilities, but did not collapse their underground buildings. The early findings conclude that the strikes over the weekend set back Iran's nuclear program by only a few months. Before the attack, U.S. intelligence agencies had said that if Iran tried to rush the making of a bomb, it would take about 3 months. after the U.S. bombing run and days of attacks by the Israeli Air Force, the report by the Defense Intelligence Agency estimated that the program was delayed less than 6 months. What can you tell us about what this means in terms of, again, a military operation that was, in terms of hitting its target, successful, but a foreign policy which admittedly hasn't been super clearly communicated to the American people? But if the message that Donald Trump delivered Saturday night was that we obliterated Iran's nuclear program, it's clear that this reporting seems to call that into question.
Absolutely, Nicole. I mean, it's a very devastating report. Assuming it's accurate, it's an initial assessment. We should caveat it, and U.S. intelligence officials are still trying to collect information. But the first assessment here runs very much against the president's initial report and assessment to the American people, which, you know, was always sort of an improbably quick conclusion for the president to draw. You know, it takes time after an attack like that to figure out what has happened. And so it never really made sense that the president had that degree of certitude so quickly. And even by Sunday morning, other U.S. officials were not using the same kind of language that he is, but that he was in that initial response. But look, you know, this was a high risk operation. Not only in the sense of the military risk, which fortunately, you know, no U.S. personnel were harmed or even challenged, it appears, but in terms of the long-term consequences and Iran's reaction, which, you know, the full dimensions of which we still don't know, even if there is this fragile ceasefire in place. And there's also the strong possibility that Iran will regroup and try to accelerate and crash to build a nuclear weapon very quickly as a result of this attack. So it was a high-risk attack, and the president initially sold it as having an extremely high reward. But this report now suggests that the skeptics who said that you can, you know, we have incredible military capabilities, but it's just very, very hard to completely take out these underground targets, and you have to be careful about doing that because there's going to be a cost. Those skeptics are looking a lot smarter right now as a result of this initial intelligence assessment.
Ned, I'm going to do two things. I want to read a little bit more from the story, and then I want to show you what the chairman of Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, said the morning after Trump described the mission as, quote, obliterating Iran's nuclear capabilities. The Times makes this point, quote, the findings suggest that President Trump's statements that Iran's nuclear facilities were obliterated was overstated, at least based on the initial damage assessment. Congress had been set to be briefed on the strike on Tuesday, and lawmakers were expected to ask about the findings of this assessment, but the session was postponed. Senators are now set to be briefed Thursday. The report also said that much of Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium was moved before the strikes, which destroyed little of the nuclear material. Some of that may have been moved to secret nuclear sites maintained by Iran. And then let me show you what General Kane said.
And to the chairman, you said the battle damage assessment is still ongoing, but do you believe that some nuclear capability in Iran remains?
Thanks for your question. I think BDA is still pending, and it would be way too early for me to comment on what may or may not still be there. But thanks for the question.
So the country's top military official, much more careful than the president in the aftermath.
Yeah, you're right, Nicole. A strikingly different tone than what we heard from President Trump in the immediate aftermath. And by the way, also a pretty strikingly different tone that we heard from Pete Hegseth, who was standing right at the lectern right next to him during that very press conference. Look, as we think about the moment we're in and how to assess the decisions that our leaders have made over the past 96 or so hours, I think it's important that we not lose sight of the original assignment. So many people have. Let's be clear, the original assignment was not merely containing the crisis that President Trump helped to precipitate on Saturday and to prevent this from spiraling into World War III. If that were the underlying assignment, assignment, of course, let's pop the champagne and grade President Trump with an A+. But we all know, Nicole, that the original assignment was in some ways helping to contain the crisis that President Trump himself set in motion, not on Saturday, but in 2018, when he ripped apart essentially the Iran deal and removed the tightly controlled box that Iran's nuclear program was in. And so I think as we assess these decisions, the metric we need to keep in mind is whether this president was able to achieve his goal. And the goal was always to permanently and verifiably prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. As we've learned from the New York Times today, as we've heard from people like J.D. Vance and even the Prime Minister of Israel over the past 72 hours, there is good reason to think that there is nothing permanent or verifiable about what has happened. First, we know it's not verifiable. We know it's not verifiable because this was done at the barrel of the gun. This was not done through diplomacy, which would have allowed international weapons inspectors, potentially even American authorities, to sort through sites like Fordo, sites like Natanz, sites like Isfahan. Instead, we are now reliant on our intelligence community to try and get a sense of where are the stockpiles of enriched uranium? Are there centrifuges that are left? Is Iran, as the New York Times reported last week, now incentivized to sprint not towards a nuclear weapon, but perhaps even a crude nuclear device? And so that all takes us to this issue of just how permanent this is. And the short answer, Nicole, it's not permanent. The New York Times today says it may have set back Iran's program months. And that's thinking Iran wants to put together a sophisticated nuclear weapon if they make that decision to do so. My concern is that now we've given Iran every incentive to dart for something that may be even easier. If there are still stockpiles of enriched uranium, if there are still centrifuges they can spin, even in small spaces, that's going to be a tremendous problem for us. It was not a problem before last Saturday. It is a problem now.